for this week. I want to start by showing you this map. This is the sort of world of the First West, and this is a world that I'd like you to think about in terms of three overlapping social worlds. The first is the world of empire, that is, a world divided between the British Empire, the French Empire, and the Spanish Empire, all of whom in the beginning of the 17th century start making claims to parts of North America, all of whom engage with native peoples in a mercantile fashion, exchanging trade goods, usually manufactured goods, often for processed furs and hides, as well as for other things like wampum jewelry, that kind of thing. The world of empire also is a world of settler colonies. This is the sort of second social world. The settler colonies that you can see here are the traditional English colonies, what we could think of as the 13 original colonies, as well as New France and New Spain. Now, the British North American colonies are usually defined by large coastal cities and settlement along the coastline. This is true really until post-American Revolution, when the British colonies become the United States of America. Settlement is, for the most part, on the eastern seaboard and connected with large port cities. As I said, mercantile trade, both with Indians and between colonists and the mother country, are important factors in early North American history. In fact, this trade is a driver of most of the political economy of North America. The world of settler colonies is a little bit different than the world of empires. It's more localized. People have relationships with native people. Demographically, the majority of people in North America are still American Indians. There have been, since the mid-1600s, a series of devastating wars. Our class begins sometime around the mid to late 1700s. We're really going to start looking at some documents that occur around the time of the Seven Years' War. By that point, there have been a series of conflicts, both in the Northeast, in the Plymouth colony, the Pequot War, King Philip's War, a series of other conflicts in farther south. And you have had a lot of Indians by the 1700s, mid to late 1700s, have been displaced from coastal regions. In the beginning, the world of settler colonies is very much intermixed with the world of Indians. By the time we reached the 7 Years' War period, that's not so much true. Most Indians have been driven from the coast. There are large refugee populations in the interior. Now, the West for us really constitutes the region to the west of Appalachia, the west of this line here. In fact, we can think of the West according to the terms of the Treaty of the 7 Years' War, the Treaty of Paris, which establishes a proclamation line. At the conclusion of the 7 Years' War, the British, who emerged victorious against the French and a number of native allies, or native peoples allied to France, at the end of this war, France agrees that it will leave North America, give its North American colonies over to the British in exchange for a proclamation line. That is a line that would limit Western settlement by Anglo-American settlers, preserving territory for their Indian allies. This is the other world I want you to think about, and this is the sort of native new world. That is, it is the new world in the sense that it has been profoundly changed by the arrival of Europeans and by the joining of the eastern and western hemispheres of the globe after having been separated for millennia. This new world is changed by the existence of trade goods, relationships with Europeans, the exchange of ideas, perhaps most importantly, the exchange of microbes. Epidemic disease has a huge and negative impact on native populations. Nevertheless, this transformed new world is still dominated by native peoples when you get to the region west of the Appalachian Mountains. There are a number of native coalitions that emerge in this time period. In the Great Lakes, you'll see there are people that are thought of as Chippewa or Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi. They are Anishinaabe people, more or less. They're the Iroquois in what would be upstate New York, another coalition of 5 and then later 6 nations that function as a confederacy. By around 1700 or so, these people are around 30 to 40,000 in population, so a very big population. They're significantly diminished by the 1700s, roughly half that size, but they're still formidable in part because they are a multi-nation confederacy. That means they can mobilize a lot of people over a lot of territory. There are, as I mentioned, also many refugees that have poured from the East Coast into this region along the Proclamation Line, the Ohio Valley country, what would now be Ohio and Kentucky. These are people like the Delaware who've been pushed off the East Coast. Also, people from the New England areas who've moved west over time. The Delaware, the Shawnee, are the principal drivers of this sort of coalition of Indians in the Ohio country, and they extend that alliance to native peoples in the South, the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, and the Choctaw, and the Creek. These are the major tribes in the Southeast. These are also significant tribes in terms of population and social organization, ranging in size from um, around 10 to 15,000 people, down from 30 to 40,000 per tribal group at the outset of European arrival through loss of population to disease, to warfare, etc. But nevertheless, they're still formidable um, uh, native nations. They control the interior, and at the Seven Years' War, and the emergence after the Seven Years' War, there is increasingly a north-south alliance between the southeastern Indians and the refugee Indians in the Ohio country. This is the alliance that Americans will run into when they begin to expand west after the Revolution. This is the confederation of Indians that people like Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett will run into as they expand their territory. And as they move west, they will be moving west with this sort of ideology of discovery, the ideology of discovery and conquest that they bring over from Europe. That is, the ocean of discovery is that North America is an unsettled continent. There's a recognition that there are Indian people there, but there is a belief that the way that they live their lives without private property, without government, at least from the perspective of Europeans, that's obviously not true, means that they are uncivilized, they are barbarians. And because of this, they have no recognized, from an English perspective, civil government. Therefore, they haven't settled the land, and it remains to be settled by civilized people, people who follow a true religion, Christianity, people who exercise property or create property from wilderness, property rights then are conferred into political rights as people join together in collective social bodies. You'll read about this in John Locke. That's where the Locke piece is in there. It's very important for how not only Europeans conceptualize the New World, but also important for how Americans conceptualize the New World and their relationship both with the continent, the landmass itself, and with the native peoples who live on that continent. American expansion is very much a question about the exercise of individual citizens' right to own property, to create property where they believe no property has been created, to for example, create a fenced fixed farm property that is then recognizable as property, and therefore enough property settlement or enough property settlers coming together becomes a basis for American expansion, how you create new territories out of the West and incorporate them into the United States. The legal mechanism by which you do this is the Northwest Ordinance, also the treaty-making process. These are also things that you will read. There is also a considerable amount of violence through this process as Americans expand into what they call the back country, or the First West, pushing past the Appalachians into the Ohio country, into the Great Lakes. That violence you'll also read about. It happens in wars like the Seven Years' War, the War of 1812. It happens in the clash between settlers and Indians as they fight over competing claims to land and hunting territory and so forth. So that's another really important aspect of the readings for this week, that American expansion is very much intertwined with a violent process of conflict with Indian peoples. You're also reading, say, the Declaration of Independence, because I want you to keep in mind that as Anglo-America transforms from a world of colonies and empire to the United States, at the very origin of the United States, people are wrestling with what it means that they're Indians on the continent. Indians show up in the Declaration of Independence. A large part of the complaint against George III is the failure of the Crown to protect colonists from Indians. It also shapes the relationship between the new United States and Native peoples, as you'll see in treaties. The U.S. establishes itself as the sole authority by which Native peoples can sell land to Americans. So these are all founding documents, more or less, that explain both how Americans understand their place in this world of North America and how they see their relationship to Native peoples, to Western expansion. You'll also note, here is a map of New France, made by the people of New France, that they are carrying with them a legacy of colonial empire. This map, which is from the 1680s, represents how the French saw the world in North America. That is, they saw it as a place that they had discovered and therefore owned. So they claim right of possession, or possession by right of discovery. And that's important in terms of thinking through the documents that we have today and thinking about the way in which, the context for which you should think through these documents and answer your questions sort of collectively. So I hope this is helpful, and I'll try to get it posted to the CTOOL site.